word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Friends, since moving to New Mexico, I have found myself hiking more than I have ever hiked in my entire life. And I've learned that my favorite kinds of hikes are slot canyons. I marvel at the history embedded in the rocks and steep walls. I've hiked slot canyons both in Jemez and at Tent Rocks, and last week I added my third slot canyon to the list. It's a slot canyon in Las Cruces. And for several reasons, this most recent slot canyon was different. My partner Eric and I should have known from the start, because rather than a well-kept trail with a prominent trailhead, we started the hike by climbing a fence. A fence with the sign, "Keep fence closed at all times." After we successfully climbed over, the next challenge was finding the trail. We followed a path looking for any other hikers, but could not see or hear anyone. So naturally, we started asking ourselves, is this a good idea? Should we be hiking here? Should we just turn around and go back now? Now, friends, our hike, it was much different than the wilderness Jesus encountered. But nonetheless, it was a wilderness to us, an unknown landscape, wild and alive. This story of Jesus that we hear today, the story of Jesus in the wilderness, this is the final part of Jesus' lengthy introduction in the Gospel according to Luke. And it also includes Jesus' inaugural act. Inaugural acts in the Gospels are important because they set the tone for Jesus' ministry. If you'll remember, in Mark, Jesus' inaugural act is changing water into wine at a wedding. But here in Luke, Jesus wanders in the desert, rejecting the devil. It's as if from the very beginning, the author of Luke wants us to know that Jesus' responses in this desert tale tells us that Jesus is someone to be trusted. Even in the midst of the wilderness, while he is hungry and tired, when he is famished, Jesus chooses to remain faithful. Jesus could have chosen to leave, or he could have chosen to make bread or bring forth water or choose power, yet he chose to stay in the thick of the wilderness, a choice he will make again and again on his journey to the cross. Jesus wrestles with pain, suffering, and temptation over and over again. He could have tapped out. He could have backed off, but instead he keeps walking in the wilderness of sin and pain and suffering, choices that will ultimately lead to his death. Jesus could have left, but he chose to stay. Now, Eric and I tentatively chose to keep going on our hike. But we did reassess our choice about every 5 steps. But then out of nowhere, we saw a cairn. The sight of these stacked stones caused us to have the biggest exhale. A cairn is a Scottish word for a heap of stones. Back in Neolithic times, cairns were often used for burial mounds and sacred site markers. In our modern age, they are used by hikers to mark out a trail, be it a burial or a landmark. A cairn is a beacon in the midst of the wilderness, a flashpoint to help us find our next right steps. Jesus chose to stay. Jesus chose to stay alongside the hurting, the grieving, the poor. He remained faithful in his choices to care for the brokenhearted and the downtrodden, and those choices begin here in the wilderness. Jesus chose the wilderness. Jesus chose to be near us, to be in the wilderness with us. Yet even Jesus does not do this alone. The first verse of this story makes this abundantly clear. Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, went to the wilderness. Jesus entered the wilderness with the fullness of the Holy Spirit. Jesus knew he could not make this journey on his own. Jesus could not do it on his own. And dear ones, neither can we. Like a cairn, like the Holy Spirit, we need beacons and trailblazers and handholders in this wilderness. The story of Jesus teaches us we were never meant to journey this path alone. We are meant to travel together. Now, Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, stepped out into the wilderness. Now, Eric and I simply followed the cairns to the canyon's entrance. And when you walk far enough into a slot canyon, there comes a point where you can turn around, but you cannot see the path behind you. And you cannot see more than a few turns ahead of you. The steep, narrow walls, curving path follows the fractures and fault lines and erosion. And it is beautiful and it is unnerving. As the light dwindles and the path becomes more narrow, it is not uncommon for people to turn around, to not want to go forward. So they choose to leave the wilderness. Although it's not like you can get lost, you can only choose to go forward or to turn around. It's too narrow to go one way or the other, left or right. But either way, you will eventually find your way out of the canyon. However, when you do not know what lies ahead, it can be so easy to want to turn back to what you know, to leave the wilderness for the comfort of your car. Sometimes all we want to do is leave the wilderness behind. But yet, as Christians, we know God does God's work in the wilderness. Abram and Sarai become Abraham and Sarah. The Israelites were brought up from Egypt and led into the wilderness to make their new home. Hagar is provided refuge and water, and Jacob wrestles with God and comes away profoundly changed. God's work is wilderness work, no matter how we got there. Some of us choose the wilderness like Jesus, while others find ourselves cast out into it like Hagar. We don't always get to choose how we get there, but we do get to choose if we stay, and if we allow God to be near us, to be a beacon, to change our lives. We do not wander alone. In a conversation with Kate Bowler, author Parker Palmer talks about what he calls the tragic gap. The tragic gap is the wild and inevitable space between how things are and the way they could be. Now, here's the thing about the tragic gap. It's not just tragic because it's sad. It's tragic because it's inevitable. We all find ourselves there because of forces beyond our control. It's the wilderness we so often find ourselves in. It's the waiting rooms, the funeral home parlors. It's our classrooms and grocery stores. It's our street corners and our boss's office. It's our family's dinner table with an empty chair. It's the loneliness, grief, and pain within our hearts that cause them to break. Now, Palmer offers that broken hearts in unfinished times are a beacon for us in the wilderness. And he says that there are only two ways for a heart to break. A heart can shatter into shards that lie useless on the floor, or we could expose our hearts to little heartbreaks and strengthen our heart muscles so that heart becomes so tender, so supple, that it breaks open into largeness and can be put back together in a new way. This is the way of the heart Jesus shows us again and again. Not shards of hearts ready to pierce ourselves or one another, but supple hearts broken open, reflecting truth and grace in this world and building cairns along the way. Jesus chose to stay in the wilderness, and God invites us to stay too. Because here's the thing, if we really wanted, we could turn around and run from the wilderness. We could lean into what Palmer calls coercive cynicism and focus on surviving the systems for ourselves by any means necessary, including gaming the system just to survive. Or we could flip out into irrelevant idealism, pretending that everything is okay or that it eventually will be, when we know deep down things will never be the same again. But that is not the work we are called to. Rather, God calls us to stand in the gap, to stay in the wilderness. And as we find ourselves there, our job is to put one foot in front of the other as we make our way slowly through the gap towards healing, towards something better. We walk even with tiny steps towards healing and justice with hearts so supple and tender. We respect our time to rest. We seek the renewal we need, and we look for the cairns we need and the cairns we can build. The wilderness is a wild place, but it is wild because it is alive. The story of God and God's people show us that again and again and again. Now, when it was time, Jesus left that physical wilderness after 40 days completely changed. This inaugural and faithful choice he makes sets the tone for the rest of his ministry. He chooses to be with those who are hurting. He chooses to stand in the tragic gap, the inevitable tidal waves of life and world, and walks with us. He knows our grief, our pain, our hunger, and our thirst. And he ensures that we are not alone, stone on stone. Jesus is with you in your wilderness. He is with all of us in the tragic gap, when the forces beyond our control render us speechless, hopeless, and stuck. And he beckons us forward. He calls us forward to break open our hearts so they may be healed in a new way. Beloveds, this is good news. Thanks be to God. And now, dear ones, will you please